How language affects thought. Language is important. It's our main source of communication with others. It allows us to express ideas, share experiences, and create connections. For many of us, language is also our main tool for communicating with ourselves. Our thoughts are encoded with language before we're even conscious of it. But every language is different. Does our native language affect how we think and see the world? According to the theory of linguistic relativity, it does. Linguistic relativity is credited to Benjamin Lee Whorf and his mentor, Edward Sapir. It's also known as the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis. While working as a safety inspector, Whorf saw the power of language on people's thoughts. When workers in a factory saw a gas canister labeled empty, they took this to mean not dangerous, when in fact the empty canisters were more likely to explode than full ones due to highly flammable residue left in the canisters. This connection between words and actions pushed Whorf down the road to linguistics and eventually to believe that our language shapes our worldview. Now this can sound a little crazy, like mind control even. And when Whorf introduced it, that's sort of how he meant it. According to Whorf, our mother tongue imprisons us from understanding concepts outside our language. Now this idea has long since been rejected. No language can imprison thought, but it can compel us to think in certain ways. Now this idea became known as linguistic relativity. Here's how it works. Languages are each organized in different ways. What's most important to the people who use the language will often be the focus of the language, much like the organization of a city. Industries, resources, and geographical features are just a few of the factors that determine how a city is organized and built. Languages, like cities, are designed by its users with the needs of its users in mind. Because of this, our native language often seems like a logical, unbiased organizational system. It's so embedded in our thoughts and consciousness that we can't imagine anything else. But as we explore other languages, it becomes clear that each organizes the world a little differently, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. We begin to see that maybe our language isn't the best. It's simply what we know. This all seems reasonable. People have different needs, and therefore languages develop differently. But how did the differences shape our thoughts? Let's look at an example. We'll start with the second person singular pronoun. In English, you. In English, this example is simple. You refers to you, and you. Everyone is a you. But imagine you're a French speaker. Now there are two separate words for you, one formal and one informal. Suddenly you and you are very different. English used to have this divide, but at some point speakers no longer found the division necessary, and the word thou fell out of use. This small difference of formal versus informal is enough to confuse many English speakers when they learn a language like French. But now imagine you speak Japanese. Japanese has at least 9 variations of the second person singular pronoun. Japanese doesn't use pronouns in the exact same way as English, so it's hard to determine an exact number. These variations reflect the relationship between the speaker and listener, as well as the tone the speaker wants to suggest, like rude, considerate, respectful, or joking. According to linguistic relativity, by constantly forcing speakers to label their relationship with others, languages like Japanese and French shape speakers' thoughts to constantly consider the status of a relationship in a way English speakers aren't required to do so. These differences enforce cultural ideals that already exist, as well as furthering them in society by marking them as important. English, on the other hand, suggests that everyone is equal, at least in terms of pronouns. This is one way language can shape thought. But the theory's implications have wider effects than simply French speakers thinking differently than Japanese speakers who think differently from English speakers. As linguists have pointed out, every person speaks their own language a little differently. Let's look at another example. This time, storytelling. Maybe you've traveled to a new place and realized what people use stories for and how they tell them can differ greatly from place to place. Linguist Deborah Tannen has shown that speakers of New York Jewish dialect, a dialect that has spread along the northeast coast of the US, have a very distinct use of stories. Speakers will tell stories in rounds. Each person takes a turn telling a quick story on the subject, often cutting one another off to get their story in. This creates a sense of intimacy and bonds the group as it shows enthusiasm and interest. Contrast that with storytelling from the Midwest. As linguist Barbara Johnstone explains, there, stories are meant to be factual reports of what occurred. Details are told, like full names of those involved, even if the listeners won't know them, as a way to provide evidence that the story is true. Exaggeration is considered a lie, and listeners never interrupt because it's seen as rude. What implication could this difference in language use have on thought and cultural ideals? Linguistic relativity could explain why people from the Midwest tend to be more straightforward and direct, versus those from the Northeast who use exaggeration and sarcasm more frequently. For those in the Northeast, the experience of telling the story is much more important than the story itself. In the Midwest, the storyteller is not of importance. It's all about the story. As with any theory, the implications have shortcomings as well. Linguists have shown that every person uses language differently. This means every person thinks differently. While language can encourage us to organize the world in a certain way, it does not imprison us. It does not force us to think that way. All of this begs the question, how does language affect your thought?